This is John Reps, Professor Emeritus at Cornell University. What you are about to see and hear is an illustrated lecture on how towns were planned in an important region of the American West. The region was in what would become Utah, and the town planners and settlers were Mormons, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. What I have to say is based on archival research done many years ago in Utah and elsewhere, and more recently a study of many other text and cartographic records now available in digital form. Generations of students once learned about the American West from Ray Billington's book, Westward Expansion. He and his mentor, Frederick Jackson Turner, described frontier settlement as a sequential process that Billington claimed, although varying slightly with time and place, remained largely consistent until the continent was occupied. This process began with they thought, with the domain of the fur traders, followed in turn by the cattlemen, the miners, the pioneer farmers, the equipped farmers, and only then the final stage of urbanization. Here is Billington explaining how and why towns developed on the frontier. The specialists drawn to the West by the magnet of opportunity, millers, merchants, grain dealers, slaughterers, distillers, speculators, schoolmasters, dancing teachers, lawyers, and editors, chose their home sites at strategically located points in the center of agricultural communities, usually selecting a crossroads, a point at the head of navigation on some stream, or an advantageous spot on a canal or railroad. As more and more concentrated there, a hamlet, then a village, then a town, gradually took shape. How logical and convincing, and so dreadfully and maddeningly wrong. In fact, as America expanded to and beyond the Great Plains, farming followed urban development in many areas rather than coming first. In other parts of the West, urban and rural settlement took place simultaneously. Further, almost nowhere did towns grow in random patterns or emerge spontaneously from some crossroad hamlet. In no part of the West did the theories of Turner and Billington bump more forcefully against the hard facts of history than in what we call the Great Basin, centering on Utah and Nevada. Although circumstances of settlement in this region are unique, the central role town planning played in this episode of our history is typical rather than exceptional. Most of this part of the American frontier was settled by members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They are known as Mormons, and their story begins in 1823. That is when Joseph Smith, a lad of 17 living in Palmyra, New York, told of being visited by an angel, the angel Moroni, who told him of golden tablets containing the text of a lost biblical account buried in Hill Cumorah near the Smith home. According to Joseph, the angel returned to him during the next 4 years, and in 1827 gave him the tablets to be transcribed. Although written in what Smith identified as Reformed Egyptian, he was able to translate the text with the aid of a special stone, allowing him to see the words as if written in English. Published in 1830, the Book of Mormon identified America as the site for the second coming of Jesus Christ. He would appear at a place called the City of Zion, where he would rule during the millennium. That April, Smith and 5 others organized the church, and within a month the congregation numbered 40 persons. Smith sent missionaries to western Missouri to preach to Native Americans, identified by him as the Lamanites, who, according to the Book of Mormon, had reached America from Jerusalem about 589 B.C. After preaching near the town of Independence in western Missouri, the missionaries returned east to find Smith and his followers had moved to Kirtland, Ohio. In March 1831, Smith announced a revelation directing the Mormons to go forth into the western countries, to the New Jerusalem, and purchase the lands and make a commencement to lay the foundation of the city. Smith and 29 other Mormons set out for independence, where another revelation identified the place where the city of Zion should be located. 2 years later, Smith prepared a plan for the city and sent it to Missouri with detailed instructions. The site was to be 1 mile square, with streets 8 rods or 132 feet wide, intersecting at right angles. Except for 7 longer blocks in the center, each block was divided into 20 lots, measuring 66 by 330 feet, with the entire block being 660 feet square. Now think about that dimension for a moment. From the goal line of a football field to the back of the opposite end zone is 330 feet. Each side of a City of Zion block was to be twice that distance. 3 of the larger central blocks were to contain the bishop's storehouse and sites for 12 temples for the orders of the priesthood. The plan also incorporated a primitive kind of zoning and building code. For Smith specified, no one lot is to contain more than 1 house, and that to be built 25 feet back from the street. All the houses are to be built of brick and stone. A revised plan enlarged the city to a square 2 miles on each side, increased the blocks from 49 to 132, eliminated one of the central squares, and reduced the number of 8-rod streets to 4. Both plans included a strange feature Smith described in these words. You will observe that the lots are laid off alternately in the blocks. In one block, running from the south and north to the line through the center, and in the next, the lots run from east and west. This bizarre feature is a reliable guide to a town's Mormon origin, but little else can be said in its favor. A resident looking across the street would at best see only the side and side yard of a neighbor's house. Far more likely, the view would be to a backyard privy, woodshed, trash pile, chicken coop, barn, and stable, mountain of manure with its buzzing flies, and perhaps a cow or two and a few rows of corn. No City of Zion was ever created at Independence, but a modified version was begun at Kirtland. Smith's first plan in 1833 called for a mile-square site, with enormous blocks, long narrow lots, and the system of alternating frontage. However, streets here were only 66 feet wide, and the temple site was reduced to a more realistic 1/3 of the central block. A much enlarged version of Kirtland's plan came from Smith 4 years later. This required a site more than 2 miles on each side, and with street width, block and lot size, and alternating lot orientation, like the first. Construction of the temple began before the second town plan appeared. Dedicated in 1836, it is now under the jurisdiction of a Mormon-inspired church called the Community of Christ. It is the only Mormon temple that may be entered by Gentiles, the word used by Mormons to identify those who are not members of their church. As Kirtland grew, Mormons in Missouri were repeatedly attacked by earlier residents of Independence, and by 1836 several thousand had fled north across the Missouri River. That summer, 2 leaders of the Missouri Saints, William Phelps and John Whitmer, selected a mile-square site for what became the city of Far West. Phelps was said to have been a skilled surveyor, and he may have been its planner. My color added to a redrawing of the original manuscript locates the temple site at the center. It is bordered by 2 pairs of 132-foot wide streets that I've colored gray. The smaller lots in yellow face one of the 132-foot streets. Elsewhere, lots are square, 4 to each square block. There's not much City of Zion in this plan. Instead, it resembles Philadelphia with its 5 squares, or some Midwestern county seat with its central courthouse square faced by shops and offices. Smith arrived at Far West in March 1838, fleeing from Kirtland, where many of his followers had denounced him as a false prophet, and where earlier he had been tarred and feathered. He was also responsible for a financial disaster. Forbidden by Ohio law from opening a bank, but having already done so and printed banknotes, Smith simply added the prefix ante to the bank's name, where I have placed a red arrow on a copy of the banknote. Ohio authorities closed the bank, and the Panic of 1837 brought financial ruin to many trusting members of Smith's congregation. Accompanying Smith to Far West was Brigham Young, a carpenter by trade, who adopted the Mormon faith in 1832. Young was 37 when he rejoined his fellow saints in Missouri, among them his spouse, the former Mary Ann Angel. It would not be Young's last marriage, for his career as a husband had scarcely begun. My concern, however, is with Brigham Young as a father of towns. When Smith and Young reached Missouri, the Mormon population numbered about 5,000, and hundreds more streamed into the region during the summer of 1838. They settled in Far West, and in a second town Smith planned 25 miles to the north, named Adamantiaman. None of its street, block, or lot dimensions followed the City of Zion model, although its 2-mile square size, grid plan, central temple site, and alternating lot frontage system were retained. Between Far West and Diamond, Smith selected a spot for a third town, but before it could be surveyed, mobs of hostile residents set upon the Mormons in a new wave of religious persecutions. Smith was jailed, the governor of Missouri ordered all Mormons to leave the state, and Brigham Young led some 12,000 saints north and east across the Mississippi to Illinois in the winter of 1838-39. Rejoining his congregation in April, Smith bought land in southwestern Illinois on a bend on the Mississippi River. This included the site of a failed town called Commerce that he renamed Nauvoo. He added 2 wider streets and extended the Commerce pattern of streets only 49.5 feet wide, forming square blocks, each divided into 4 square, 1-acre lots. Temple construction began in 1841, and this gleaming white structure offered Mormons a reassuring sign that they had at last found a permanent and secure home. By 1842, Nauvoo was the most populous town in Illinois, and the Nauvoo Legion, a paramilitary force commanded by Smith, suggested that Mormons would never again suffer persecutions and humiliations that had made them almost a nomadic people. Smith, however, chose this moment to reveal to the church leadership his doctrine of plural marriage. Many of the faithful denounced him and left the church, and his troubles were compounded when he was arrested on a charge of attempting to assassinate the governor of Missouri. Although Smith won acquittal, a new indictment for treason caused him to be jailed. While waiting trial, he and his brother Hiram were killed by a mob in June 1844. His position as leader of the church fell to Brigham Young, who, in the face of mounting violence, announced the decision to abandon Nauvoo and seek a new kingdom for the saints far beyond the frontier of settlement. In February 1846, Young led a band of 2,000 Mormons over the frozen Mississippi as the vanguard of what became a mass migration of epic dimensions. Throughout that fateful year, thousands of Mormons marched across Iowa toward an uncertain future in some distant and unknown sanctuary. They left behind a beleaguered city, and eventually some vandal fired the temple itself. But by that time, for most Mormons, Nauvoo was but a memory. Young reached the Missouri River in June 1846, and on its western bank, in what is now Omaha, he planned winter quarters to serve as the marshalling point for the journey's next stage. On that simple linear grid over the winter of 1846-47, more than 12,000 Mormons crowded into cabins or gathered in equal discomfort at Canesville, now Council Bluffs, across the river in Iowa. In early April 1847, Young led an advance party up the North Platte River, across the Rockies, and eventually through a pass on the western slope of the Wasatch Range. From what is now called Emigration Canyon, he looked down on the arid valley of the Great Salt Lake, where Young chose to settle. On July 28, he and his associates planned what would become Salt Lake City, using the City of Zion concept as their model, but departing from it in some important details. For example, the site was not square. Only one 10-acre block was reserved for temple use, and it was off-center. 3 additional blocks were designated for community use, and all streets were made 132 feet wide instead of only those defining the temple block. The plan departed from the Zion model in yet another way. Blocks had only 8 lots instead of Zion's 20, and thus each lot was not only 330 feet long, but 165 feet wide. It is said Young wanted each family to have a site large enough for a few farm animals, land for crops more extensive than a kitchen garden, and space for a variety of domestic buildings. On the block colored yellow, the pioneer party built the walls of a temporary fort where the first settlers erected small cabins. 4 new tiers of blocks, outlined in black, enlarged the town plan after the arrival of 1,500 immigrants in September. The fort was also expanded to include blocks to the north and south, and in its restricted area 450 cabins provided shelter for the first winter. Beyond the city on the west, Young divided land into garden and farm tracts of 5, 10, 20, 40, and 80 acres. There, in the fall of 1848, settlers received their shares through a lottery system. A year earlier, Young and other church leaders agreed on their own holdings, each consisting of several lots within the city as well as farmland in the surrounding area. As new residents arrived, the fort was dismantled, the city was somewhat enlarged to the west and very substantially expanded to the east. In all, 77 additional blocks were added, each divided into lots like those of 1847. In 1853, Frederick Piercy sketched the infant city as seen from the north, and his companion, James Linforth, described what it portrayed. The street in the center is called East Temple Street. Proceeding down it or southward, the largest building on the left is the tithing office and church store. A little lower down on the right is the council house. Immediately in front of the council house and running to the extreme right is the temple block, on which are seen the shops of carpenters, masons, painters, and blacksmiths, and the tabernacle to the right. 20 years after its founding, the Mormon capital presented a far more imposing appearance. The artist also looked south on East Temple Street, now Main Street, to the business district beyond Temple Square. The huge tabernacle at far right was then nearly completed. Nearby only the foundations for the temple had been laid, although the artist here of this view shows it almost as if completed. Other images of that era show business buildings on East Temple Street at upper left, the home and offices of Brigham Young on the upper right-hand view, and below, the City Hall on the left and the theater. In the center is the bishop's headquarters and tithing office on the east side of Main Street, near the temple. Brigham Young's settlement strategy was to create many other towns using Salt Lake City as the base where colonization groups could be organized and supplied. He hoped to create the state of Deseret, embracing all of present-day Utah and Nevada, along with parts of 6 other states. In their first 5 years in the region, Mormons founded 20 new towns. Many were located along what came to be called the Mormon Corridor, leading south and west from Salt Lake City. They incorporated some or all of the features of the City of Zion model, although with many variations in street width and lot size. One example south of Salt Lake City is Manti. Here we see narrower streets and smaller blocks and lots. Its founding in 1850 was an early example of a process Young would follow at dozens of other places during the next 3 decades. First traveling to the chosen location to inspect and approve the site, he then selected key persons representing a variety of essential skills, and, to use the phrase employed at the time, Young called them in a kind of religious draft to form the cadre of first settlers. I do not have the Manti list, but here is one of 1861 used by Young for a similar project. Farmers, blacksmiths, barrel makers. No surprises there, but what are we to make of the 2 Daguerrean photographers, the drum major, castor oil maker, sailor, and, although Mormons did not smoke or drink, a vintner and tobacco maker? Each family was to bring household tools, domestic animals, food, medicine, as well as other supplies. Here's a list given to couples leaving for Arizona in 1876. In addition to tools and farming implements, they were to bring 600 pounds of flour, 100 pounds of bacon, 2 yoke of oxen, horses, mules, 2 guns and ammunition, a bottle of painkiller, seeds for a kitchen garden, and dozens of other supplies. At the bishop's store, the leader of the settlement party received community equipment and supplies. In addition to ample quantities of food and seeds, the group founding Parowan, Utah in 1850 took with them the following equipment: 9 1/4 sets carpenter's tools, 1 set mill irons for sawmill, 3 sets whipsaws, 110 spades and shovels, 72 scythes, 436 panes of glass, 190 pounds of nails, 3 1/2 sets blacksmith's tools, 57 plows, 137 axes, 98 hoes, 1 brass cannon, 129 guns, 9 swords, 1,001 pounds of ammunition, 44 saddles, and 52 pistols. At the site, the pioneer party built a fort whose adobe brick or stone walls enclosed cabins used during the first year of occupancy. Provo, settled in 1849 south of Salt Lake City, was typical in this respect, as was the visit that fall by Young, who came to inspect conditions and to select the exact site for the town. The next spring, a surveyor laid out the new city near the fort. His plan followed the usual grid design, but with narrower streets and smaller blocks and lots than those of Salt Lake City. Although difficult to see on this faded map, lots in Provo followed the City of Zion pattern of alternating frontage, and in addition to the central block for a tabernacle, 1 block in each of the 4 quadrants was reserved for schools. At the far end of the Mormon corridor was San Bernardino, California, where Young hoped Mormon converts from Europe could arrive by ship and thus avoid attacks like those Mormons suffered in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois. Now here the streets are narrower, the blocks are smaller, and its lots are wider than the City of Zion model, but its plan is unmistakably Mormon. North of Salt Lake City, Young chose the site for Ogden in 1850. Its plan was based on huge 40-rod square blocks like those of Salt Lake City, but with each block divided into 10 lots rather than 8, and separated by 99-foot streets instead of 132. The detail I've circled on this early plat suggests also that the alternating frontage system may have differed in some way from the City of Zion model. When the Union Pacific Rail line reached Ogden in 1869, just before its historic meeting with the Western Pacific Line, the town's economic future seemed assured. Here it is in 1875, with an added inset view of the Union Pacific Rail Yard and shops, and the hotels and other rail-related facilities that brought early prosperity and full employment. 20 miles north of Ogden, at Brigham City, a different plan and a different settlement method was used in 1854. Brigham Young designated a man named Lorenzo Snow to recruit and lead the settlement group. Snow's three-part town plan offered residents three sizes of lots, all of them facing east or west, and located on elongated rather than square blocks. Three linked public squares occupied the center of the middle section, and the main street continued south to a fourth and larger square reserved for the tabernacle. This example of axial town planning may have been influenced by what Snow saw while a Mormon missionary in Manchester and London. Snow would later go on to head the church. This plan provided opportunities to locate major buildings, terminating views along the important central axis. Instead, Main Street was extended through both of the central squares, dividing each of them into two smaller sites. On the north, one of these was used for the courthouse. The striking tabernacle also was placed on the eastern half of the lower square, with the axial view passing by it rather than terminating at its entrance. Today, the tabernacle faces the Brigham City Temple on the western half of the southern square. North of Brigham City at Logan, in 1859, Brigham Young planned a near duplicate of Salt Lake City. Here are the same enormous square blocks, huge lots, alternating frontage pattern, and very wide streets. The tabernacle occupies one of the blocks near the business center. I've colored this yellow. Not far away was an elevated site used originally as a park. On that location, construction of a temple began in 1877. This monument of muscular Christianity seems to be part church and part Crusader citadel. It made Logan one of the most impressive of all Mormon communities in the late 19th century, at a time when temple cities were few in number and regarded as places of special importance. If Logan was an example of Mormon planning orthodoxy, Farmington, just 17 miles north of Salt Lake City, must be regarded as a near-total backslider. Here, in a half-hearted reference to the alternating frontage system, not quite half the blocks face east or west in the lower left corner of the plan, with the remainder oriented to the north or south. There was nothing half-hearted about Fillmore's design on its site, well south of Salt Lake City, and exactly duplicating its plan. Now, Fillmore flourished briefly when it served as the territorial capital in the early 1850s, but when that status was revoked, it ceased to grow and remains seemingly frozen in time. The small red rectangle at far left outlines two blocks at the edge of town. On the right are duplicate copies of those blocks. At the top, notice how original lot boundaries can be reconstructed from fence and field lines. I've overdrawn them below in red. In this part of Fillmore, at least, little has changed in the land ownership pattern since the town was planned more than 160 years ago. At Salt Lake City, however, Brigham Young was himself responsible for changes that began soon after 1847. Whether or not he may have foreseen what could happen, Young planned the city's blocks with only 8 lots, each 165 feet wide. This liberated lot owners from Smith's impractical frontage system and as I've shown with red lines, allowed corner lots and others to be divided into half a dozen or more properties with a depth of 165 feet. Widths could vary in size depending on the lot's intended use, and a small corner lot could have double frontage. Merchants on State Street leading south from Temple Square were quick to realize this. Their buildings faced that thoroughfare whether or not the plan indicated otherwise. In the left foreground, you can see a more successful element of Brigham Young City. Irrigation channels bringing water into the city to make possible street trees and gardens. It was not just on the city's main street that lot owners abandoned the alternating frontage system. Look at the 6-block sample of Central Salt Lake City in 1870 and note how houses and business buildings all front the street passing by their property. At lower right is an early 20th century survey of that 6-block area, showing its buildings and property lines. Here are those 6 blocks with original lot lines in red. The two at upper left and right show how common sense triumphed over formula and theory. In the block at upper left, the yellow band indicates a badly needed alley added to provide service access. In the block at upper right, yellow identifies an entirely new street with 20 new lots fronting it. Several alleys that I've colored green were added to serve commercial properties. The two original lots facing north and south at the right-hand end of the block had become 14 lots, all oriented to face the street they were intended to ignore. Similar changes occurred in residential districts. By 1911, property owners of all 4 corner lots in this block had changed their orientation and cut each of them into half a dozen lots. 3 other owners subdivided their lots by adding dead-end streets. My 2 question marks show where houses had been built to the rear of others and thus lacked street frontage. Much of Salt Lake City was thus replanned over the years by individual property owners desperate to escape from an impractical and formulaic urban design. The original plan of Ogden was changed in a different manner. Here is the city as mapped in 1877 and is drawn in perspective in 1890. You can see the original pattern of 660-foot blocks remained intact, although many of the original lots had been divided and houses built facing the streets on all sides of the blocks. Less than 20 years later, many of the original blocks had been divided by new streets into 2 smaller blocks. On this map of 1906, the key map of the Sanborn Atlas of that year, I've circled in red most of those new streets. This was not some new or isolated part of the city, but the original town plat that Brigham Young had approved. At the top is the 1906 map attached to the perspective view of 1890. At the right, I've pasted that map over the view to emphasize the substantial size of the area that was being replanned. On a modern vertical air photo of a part of that neighborhood, I've colored in black the original 99-foot streets. New streets added after 1890 are in yellow. Unfortunately, I cannot tell you why or how this was accomplished. I know only that in 1890, an anti-Mormon political party won the local election and gained control of City Hall. The near uniformity of width, location, and orientation of the new streets tells me the municipality must have been involved. Here's a term paper or thesis topic waiting for someone to pursue, and if that has already been written, there must be dozens of other Mormon-founded towns with their own planning histories waiting to be investigated. When Brigham Young died in 1877, just 30 years after he founded Salt Lake City, Mormon settlements numbered 358. This achievement, unprecedented in the annals of urban planning, is all the more remarkable for having been carried out with limited material resources and in a region previously thought unsuitable for human habitation. By 1890, Salt Lake City was larger than Seattle, Dallas, Houston, or Sacramento, had only a few thousand persons less than Portland and Los Angeles, and visitors were deeply impressed by what they saw. One journalist called it one of the most beautiful of all modernly built cities. Residences of the rich have been built, large mercantile establishments have taken the place of adobe huts, and there is not yet a single narrow street, not a house wherein the sunlight cannot find its way, nor one whereby a stream does not run. On this map of 1886, I have marked in red the official city limits, including a town that was part of the huge western farming plant. By the time this map appeared, however, some of those farms had been subdivided into lots for individual houses. Urban sprawl began early in and around Salt Lake City. It has not stopped. On these two views from different altitudes, the larger red rectangles identify the city limits of 1847-48, and the small rectangles locate Temple Square. Beyond the lighter colored concentrations or ribbons identifying commercial and industrial buildings and apartments is a large extent of green, but do not mistake that for the open countryside. These are huge areas of predominantly low-density single-family housing. From much higher in space, you can see the irregular but unbroken band of urban development stretching 75 miles from Provo to Ogden and beyond. For this new Mormon megalopolis, the planning issues are quite different from those facing the pioneers of 1847. No modern City of Zion concept has emerged to shape the future of this linear conurbation. Its geographic center, and for many its spiritual heart, is Temple Square, the closest domestic analog to the religious precinct of a European cathedral town. Within its adobe walls stand the great temple, the unique tabernacle, and the assembly hall, all now accompanied by modern structures in the adjoining blocks containing offices, exhibits, and activities, all designed to inform the visitor, instruct the faithful, and attract the possible convert. Monuments recall major events of Mormon history. They include portrait statues of Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram standing not far from the lofty towers of the temple, with its figure of the angel Moroni sounding his trumpet. There also is a memorial to the handcart pioneers of the 1850s who, lacking ox teams and wagons, pulled these carts long miles across the plains and through the mountains. Carl Christensen, the Danish artist of Mormon history whose other paintings you saw earlier, used just such a cart to transport his belongings to Salt Lake City in the summer of 1857. Miraculous events of Mormon theology are commemorated on Temple Square. Two sculptural groups depict the restoration of biblical priesthoods. Nearby is the monument recalling the last-minute deliverance from swarms of crickets which in 1848 nearly destroyed the first crops before lake gulls suddenly swooped down to devour the insects and save the Mormons from starvation. Today, the 10-acre block of 1847 is now only part of a much larger church compound that began with Temple Square. This includes the entire city block east of Temple Square, the 132 by 660-foot area once occupied by the street separating the two, the eastern side of the block facing Temple Square on the west, and much of the space in the adjoining two blocks on the north. Midway on the southern boundary of this unique religious compound stands the figure of Brigham Young. He faces south down Main Street with his hand raised at shoulder height. It was once a joke that he was directing traffic at the intersection of Main and South Temple Streets. I think he is pointing proudly to his first and greatest accomplishment as a planner and founder of towns.